first time, the timeline might be of any help. Of course, modern China doesn't look very much like the China we're going to be talking about, because historically, most of these early dynasties, we're talking about a much smaller time span. And Angie, this would be China 1 if we're labeling today, just beginning on China. In fact, if we took Tibet out, which is really quite huge, which wasn't technically considered part of China before 1950, that's most of this area right here. And even without that, it's starting to look more like, if you cut off Tibet and this Western area, now we're getting closer into the area that we're really going to be talking about today. China's early history, in the Neolithic period, for example, is pretty similar to what we would see in other places around the world. You know, they go through this period of forming fixed communities, what we associate with the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, is sort of setting down roots, building fixed communities and more complex social structures, and beginning to make crafts and things like that. It happens pretty similar time span in most of the world, be a little bit later here, but it always happens in the same places, along major riverbeds. This is where settlements would grow, you know, fairly logically. And the same thing is true in China. In much of the world, we don't have a lot from this period. One thing we do have from Neolithic China is some of the very earliest ceramics in the world, 3,500. This is very early for ceramics anywhere. And we don't know a whole lot about these people. We call them the painted pot people, which is, you know, not a very good name. It doesn't tell us much, but they lived in, you know, the river valleys and in several different areas in China. And like most early pottery, I mean, this always begins in the late Neolithic. You're not going to make pottery until you have a fixed community, because pots are not generally the things that nomads carry around with them, not ceramic pots. They'll use maybe carved wooden vessels or stone vessels or things that aren't quite so fragile. This is typical coil or slab built. You know, when we think of pottery today, we think of the pottery wheel, right? The fast wheel that turns, but that's fairly late development in most of the world. Most early pots were coil built, where you make long, thin, like ropes of ceramics, and then you coil them and you build them up like a coil and into whatever shape you want. And then you do what's called paddling, which is generally where you have a really slow turning wheel and like a wooden paddle, and you turn it very slowly and just rub that wooden paddle to smooth out the coils, so you don't see the coils anymore. It's called coil built, sometimes just slab built, where you just take a flat slab of clay and shape it. We're going to be talking much more about ceramics in China. It's a major art form and a major industry, and there are some areas, particularly in southern China, where the conditions are just right for these fine ceramics. And Chinese ceramics in the West is one of the early introductions to Asia, is through imports of ceramics, which certainly by the 18th century, Europeans are very familiar with it. This early work is what we call earthenware. And earthenware is the earliest ceramic. It's a very low fire ceramic. In other words, the kiln is only heated to about 900 degrees Celsius. Pots like this are fairly soft. They're not really hard and brittle, but they're also very porous. And so you would have to glaze them or put something on the surface that would keep them from being so porous. We're going to see the development of more advanced ceramics as they learn how to use hotter and hotter kilns. The hotter the kiln, then you can make what's called stoneware. And if you figure out how to get it really hot and control it, then you can make things like porcelain, which is much more advanced and obviously isn't there at this particular point. But these early pieces are very similar. They're basically red and black. The red is the natural red of the clay, and then, you know, when it's fired, this black, which would have been painted on as a slip. A slip is basically a kind of liquid clay mixture. It's a different clay chemistry. When you study ceramics, you're basically studying chemistry. The first whole year of introduction to clay and glazing, you're learning chemistry, because that's what this is really all about. Chemical reactions between the different materials, and it's how you get these various sort of marks. We call it painting. We say it's a painted pot, but understand it's almost never paint. There's really no paint on ceramics. The colors and the marks and images you see come out in the firing in the kiln, where depending on how you expose it to oxygen, etc., the color, a part of it will change when another part doesn't. You take this slip, liquid clay, and you paint it on the vessel, so when you fire it, the part that's not painted will turn one color or react in one way, and the part that has the slip will react in a different way. It's where you get these variations. We'll talk much more about that when it starts becoming much more significant. Another early thing we find, and by this time, most of what we have is from tombs. That's typical of most of the world. Older art comes from tombs. And jade is one of the earliest things we see, as early as 3000, found in tombs. And this is actually what's called a Kong. It's hard to realize what it is we're looking at. It looks like a vase, but it's not a vase. It's a hollow tube that's open at both ends, and it's round in the middle, as you can see in that one, but squared on the outside. And they're all like this, and they all have similar striations. And nobody really knows what these things are, other than clearly they're important. They're jade. That was valued almost priceless in China. Some people associate them with heaven. Sometimes circular forms associated with heaven and square forms are associated with earth. So possibly the interior being round, maybe it's a tube that something passes through. I mean, people have all kinds of stories, but we have no real evidence of anything being right or wrong. Now, these are nephrite. Jade, I didn't even put jade on there, did I, on the screen? Jade is not a mineral. Jade simply means hard stone in China, and all sorts of minerals were considered jade. In this early period, and my favorite jade still is nephrite. Nephrite is this beautiful, it can be many different colors, but this beautiful brown material is nephrite. They also use like alabaster, agate. All of these were considered jade and could be considered jade. Later, there is a mineral known as jadeite. And later that will become popular, and it's more of the green colors that we're used to with jade. But really, jade is not all jadeite. The important thing is that it's very hard. That's what really matters. It's extremely hard. It symbolized power, strength, indestructibility, even immortality. Another interesting point is China doesn't actually have jade. Almost all of this is imported. They import the raw stone, and then they carve it and make items out of it and then export it. But it almost all comes from Central Asia, a lot of it from Siberia. That's the major source for the raw stone. So that's why it's so valuable, is they don't actually even have any. It's precious when they import it and then carve it and make things out of it. Here is another object that we also find in tombs along with the conch, and that's called the bee. And there are many of these. They're basically flat discs with holes in the center, sometimes elaborate. These are two different kinds of nephrite bees. They're all often found with the conch. And now it gets even more complicated. How do they relate to one another? Maybe this is the symbol of heaven. So again, with the bee, we don't really know exactly what it means, other than it's important, it's important to them, and spiritual. Okay, let's take a look at our first real dynasty, and that is the Shang. Shang dynasty is the Bronze Age in China, and the Nelson Gallery has a whole room full of Shang bronzes. They have a wonderful collection of these items, and their role is very important. We're going to look at these ceremonial vessels. Now, there are 30 to 35 different shapes of vessels. We know they're associated with the power of the king. The royal lineage during the Shang dynasty was set up as a kind of patriarchy, in that the king was seen as a sort of father figure. And he had obligations, and his principal obligation was to perform rituals and sort of keep balance within the world. We know that as a patronymy, this was important. And what developed is, excuse me, the role of these vessels in those ceremonies, and how the vessels themselves became symbols of your right to rule and symbols of your legitimacy as a ruler. This vessel on the right is in the Nelson Gallery. It's really quite beautiful. The one on the left is not. It's a very beautiful ding. Ding, the vessel on the left, is a pot that would have been used to boil meat. Preparing food ceremonially was part of the rituals, where the jia on the right is a vessel used for warming liquids, basically wine, warming wine as part of the ritual. We also know that each vessel shape had a very specific role in the ceremonies, and that your position, your hierarchy, your title within this royal family connected you to a particular vessel or a particular shape, and therefore a particular ceremony that you were part of. We know that it had something to do with interceding with ancestral spirits. We know that that was part of it. Bronze, of course, is the earliest metal used by cultures everywhere in the world. It's an alloy of copper and tin, and sometimes other materials. And the percentage and the makeup of that alloy varies all around the world. In different parts of the world, there are different alloys, which is why bronze vessels can look very different in different places. They're also affected by where they were kept. The soil, the nature, like if it's in a tomb, if it's exposed to certain kinds of soil, it's going to affect the colors and how it ages. So if you see pots there or any sort of bronze work that's a range of different kinds of colors and textures, it's because of partially the chemistry of the bronze itself, and partially the the environment in which it was kept. Interestingly, in something like the ding, where they're boiling meat in water, those legs are hollow, so that the water would heat really fast down in those legs, because you'd set those right in the fire. It's an interesting design. The bronze casting technique is completely unique to China, the way they made these. Most of the rest of the world cast bronze using what's called the lost wax method. And it's what we talked about when we looked at ancient Greek art, when we did Western art in the past. But China's technique is a little different, as is their chemistry. One of the things they do is add lead to the mix, which doesn't sound like a good idea to me. You don't really want to intentionally put lead in anything, but it actually helped with the making of the bronze, because when you add lead to bronze, it makes it pour much more easily. And it also created this interesting gray color, which you don't get if you add lead to the vessel. But they used a method called piece mold casting. And what you would do is first create a clay replica of what you want. Just make the whole thing completely out of clay, and you put all the designs carved onto it that you want on the finished product. And then you encase that completely. Well, you let it completely dry. You turn it into what we call greenware, which is where you let the clay sit for quite a long time until it gets fairly hard. It hasn't been in a kiln yet, but it's still quite hard. And then you encase it completely in clay, another layer of clay, a softer clay, which you press into the design. And then now what they do that is unique here is they then cut that into individual pieces, in this case, sort of 3 pieces. Notice it's cast upside down. They always cast it upside down. When you cast bronze, there are certain kinds of bubbles that rise to the surface, and they can leave little marks or scars right on the surface. So if you cast it upside down, those little scars will be on the bottom of the feet and you won't see them. So that's why they're cast upside down. And then you cut that apart and take it apart. And once you then take it apart, then you can sort of refine those outer cuttings. And then you remove, you take the clay vessel. Let me back that up one more. You take this clay part now that will become the mold for the interior or the negative space. So what you're going to do now is shave this down all over, and however much you shave determines how thick the walls will be. So if you shave it down 2 inches all the way around, then when you cast it, you'll have a 2-inch thick bronze piece all the way around, which is a little too big. But then once you shave that down, you put everything together. Pretend that's the clay model that's been shaved down. Now you put them all back together and you'll have gaps everywhere from the area you shaved. The gap will be exactly the amount and location of what you shaved away. Now you just pour liquid bronze in there and put the whole thing into a kiln and fire it. And then when you take it out, it's now a hard ceramic. So you just whack it with a hammer and break it all off. And there's your beautiful bronze vessel inside. So it's a little more complicated actually than the lost wax technique, but it absolutely works. What I'd like to talk about now for my doorbell rings is the design on this piece, because it's a very specific design, which you may be familiar with in Chinese art. It's called a Daoism, and it's a little mask-like image. It's sometimes called a monster face. There are various names for it. It's a very stylized mask. It's hard to read. You can read it in different ways. And in fact, you see it on different forms in jade and metalwork and on vessels. I thought I had another one there. You can read it from one way. You can see, well, this is kind of like a mouth and eyes, and that must be a horn, and those are ears. But if you split it, it's called the split style, because if you split it, then it becomes 2 faces that you're seeing from the side. Now it's 2 faces facing each other. So you can read it as 2 creatures facing inward or 1 creature facing out, if this, depending on what is the ear and what is the horn. It's a complex image, and it's meant to be hard to read. It's meant to be ambiguous. It's sort of an unstable image that changes constantly. And in fact, some people have described it as sort of almost like a hallucination of a sort of monster form you're trying to read. Whatever it is, it's a deeply rooted image that goes way back in Chinese culture. And we find it in interesting ways. I've always been struck by the relationship between Northwest Coast American Indian art and Asian art, because of course, Northwest Coast American Indians are Asian, and this is where people enter, at least some of the people that entered the United States and all of the Americas early on, around 10,000 BCE or so, come over Asian. And particularly this design is a mainstay in Northwest Coast art. You see it in this tlingit blanket. It's a very similar form. It's also hard to read. It has things that are sort of like ears, little parts that can be read as other faces, sometimes upside down. If you split it in the middle, it's like the profile of 2 faces inward. And then this at the bottom, this becomes like the beard, like a bearded figure hanging down. So whether this is diffusion, diffusion theory is controversial today for political reasons. Is this a style that just spread, traditionally with people who migrated into the Americas, or was it developed independently? There's some evidence for both, so both could be argued. But diffusion is becoming more and more political. Nobody wants to acknowledge that their culture got anything from another culture anymore. But anyway, there is a relationship wherever it might come from. After the Shang will fall to a semi-nomadic warrior people known as the Zhou. The history of China is a history of alternating between periods of consolidation and periods of disunity. You'll have one dynasty that pulls everything together, and then there'll be a period where everything falls apart for a few hundred years. And then somebody will unify again, and you'll have a big cohesive culture. And it seems it goes that way sort of continuously through all its history. The Zhou is basically, while we call it by one dynastic name, it's a decentralized dynasty. It's kind of a feudal system where the Zhou are the most powerful. And what they did was they put about 200 princes of the Zhou dynasty on the throne in all these other areas, all loyal to the Zhou, but independent in their own right. It's very much like feudal Europe or any sort of decentralized state. The Zhou worship the sun and the stars, and they're the first ones to initiate this idea of the mandate of heaven, something that all emperors from this point on will claim. The mandate of heaven is basically saying the sun god and the stars, in this case, their gods, have mandated that you should rule. It's like saying it's a divine right, although this is being a little more specific. And you were given this mandate because you are morally superior. And in fact, if you begin to fail, that's because you have not been morally superior and they're taking that power away from you. So the mandate of heaven is a very important part of the Zhou. The Zhou dynasty, now this is just the Western Zhou. If you look at the timeline, there's a Western and an Eastern. The entire Zhou dynasty lasts almost 900 years. That's very hard for me to wrap my head around, because I can't think of any country or culture anywhere else in the world that could last 900 years. And that's only one dynasty out of this long history of China. So I'm hard pressed to wrap my mind about 900 years of the Zhou. We don't have much left, but some beautiful things from tomb art. The Zhou was actually a period in which, while bronze continues, technically they've moved into the Iron Age and they're working with iron as well, but still, we do have a number of bronze bells from this period. These bells are really stunningly beautiful. They're bronze. It doesn't look like it, but it's actually not round. It's an ellipse, and they're clapperless bells. There's no clapper. You would hit it with a hammer. And see all these knobs? They're the same number on the other side, and they've been rubbed and sanded and scraped. And we believe they were doing that to tune the bell, because if you sort of take the knobs down a little bit or adjust them, you affect the tone of the bell just slightly. This Master Lai's bell, as it's known, it's one of 8. 8 was usually the smallest group that you would get. I'll show you a full set in a minute of the largest one that we've ever found. There's an inscription on the interior of the bell that says that Lai had this bell made to honor his father, and it praises the current ruler at that time, who has given Lai a great deal of responsibility. So why are these bells in tombs? This is actually the largest set that we found of 65 bells of different sizes. Each bell, in fact, can make 2 distinct disconnected tones depending on where you hit it. And from what I've read, there were usually maybe a half a dozen players would be about it on a group this size. And they would be on both sides and have like hammers in both hands playing it, probably related to funerary ritual, because then these would be left in the tomb. So probably other musical instruments, although there's nothing specific that's been named in relation to these sort of flattened ellipses. So this is the finest group that we have. This is the largest number of bells. This set can cover 5 octaves. So that's quite a lot of music. There is actually a gold inscription inlay on each bell as well that has some sort of musical commentary that talks about musical terminology, and also that comments on the performance of the pieces. Must have been beautiful to hear. This Zhou alliance eventually fell apart, as everything does, and they were forced to pull up stakes from where they were and move their capital further east. And that's sort of the second half of the Zhou dynasty, what we call the Eastern Zhou. And this is an important period. The Eastern Zhou was a period of great cultural flowering. And it's not surprising when you look at those dates, say 771 to 221 BCE, this is a great age of philosophy and art in the Mediterranean area as well. It's a very important period. This is a period not only of Plato, the founding of Buddhism, it's the period of, in China, this is the period of Confucius, and the period of Daoism is written. So this is really the great age of philosophy. It's sometimes called the 100 schools, the great age of the 100 schools, only 2 of which were Daoism and Confucianism. And it's an age of refinement in art. It's sort of taking things like, they'd been doing bees, and this is a dagger handle I decided to throw in, but it's unusually refined. I mean, this is really beautiful work. That jade bee, and I really think that's in the Nelson Gallery too. I think that's the one that's in the Nelson. That's beautiful. There are 2 different colors of jade. The dragon in the middle, we're going to talk about dragons later, but beautiful piece. And that dagger handle, that is cast bronze, cast in one piece. I mean, you see the size. It's a handle on a dagger, so it's like the size of a human hand. It's not that big. So carving those details into clay is just phenomenal in terms of the details of the piece itself. I wanted to talk about Daoism and Confucianism briefly. I sent those handouts, so again, I'm not going to go through everything, but Daoism most likely as an idea predates this period. It's very ancient. It's usually associated with someone called Lao Tzu, although Lao Tzu simply means old master, and it's highly possible there was no person named Lao Tzu. I think that's probably very likely. It was an honorary title. Probably several people over time given that title. So it's really a kind of compilation of very ancient ideas. The 3 traditions, is Daoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, really, I don't want to say they merge, because they don't. They're each unique and individual, but they form a compatible sort of triad of systems that interact with different aspects of your life. And I think that's the best way to think about it. And they're not contradictory. They're perfectly compatible with one another. It's just that some ideas aren't relevant to this particular system. So it's relevant to that system. And I kind of mentioned that in the handout. Depending on what you're concerned with at the moment, you might consider yourself a Taoist, Confucianist, and or a Buddhist at any given moment in time. The Tao, and sometimes it's spelled with a T. You'll see this in other contexts. There's more than one system for converting the Chinese ideograms into Western languages. And one system, the older system, the T was more common, but it was always still pronounced like a D. But the newer systems is more phonetic. And so I'm trying to switch over and just use the D wherever it's relevant. Just to be consistent is the most important. The Tao means the path or the way, and it's hard to define, but it's basically just means the natural order of things, and putting oneself in harmony with the natural order of things, is an idea that you can see will later become, quite recognizable to Buddhists, for example, or even Confucianism, because Confucius would see things in the same way. I love this little description that I put down here that says the Tao gives birth to the one gives birth to the two give birth to the three give birth to every living thing. All things are held in yin and carry yang, and they are held together in the qi of teeming energy. So Tao, the Tao, it's not really Tao, it's the Tao, is really a kind of creative process that really gives birth to all things. The origin, sometimes it's described as the origin and mother of the 10,000 things. 10,000 things just kind of means everything. The yin and yang symbol, which we associate so much with the Tao, and I'm talking about this because we're going to see direct influence of all three of these things in art very clearly. Not quite this early, but we will definitely see it. The yin and yang is really, in fact, the words literally mean the light side of the mountain and the dark side of the mountain. And so it's going to have a huge impact on landscape, as you can imagine, because the whole idea is constructed around landscape ideas, this essence of dynamic equilibrium and balance. And also a mention of the qi, that basic life force. We're going to see that impacting in landscape painting as well. So I'm going to sort of leave that for now. I don't really need to go over it more, but we'll talk about it when it comes up. Confucianism, here, sorry. Would have helped if I'd had that on the screen. One thing I do want to say before I leave this list, that second to the last, reality is a process, not a fixed thing. And that idea strikes me so strongly because it's such an important idea in the West by the late 19th century. Eastern philosophies and religions begin entering Europe in the 19th century, like by mid-century, the 1860s, 70s. And this is when you begin to see things in the West like theosophy, philosophies like theosophy. You see it in art, the influence of things like Japanese prints. But this idea, we don't often talk about this idea as reality as a process. But if you remember the Western art course, this is like the basic concept of the early definition of modernism. Modernism, remember, seeing things as an action, like reality is not a fixed, stable thing. Reality is a process. It's an accumulation of experiences. And I think those ideas that were so profound, really, like in the 1890s and the early 20th century, I see those coming again with this Eastern philosophy coming into Western Europe. So important ideas going back and forth. Confucianism is interesting because we don't have anything quite comparable to it in the West, because in the West we're since the Enlightenment, we're obsessed with organizing knowledge and information into discrete, separate categories. And Confucianism is just the opposite of that. Confucianism is, as it says, it's metaphysics, it's ethics, it's sociology, religion, it's everything, including politics, all for the goal of social civility. He gives us his 5 cardinal virtues. These are important too. These are interesting, some more than others. The idea of being a good person, the idea of putting that into practice, of rites and rituals, and this li, L-I, li, which is rights, that goes beyond sort of, it's not necessarily like religious rites and ceremonies, but rules of behavior between individuals. It's like a ritualistic behavior between people. Ritual says you respond this way, or you treat this person in this way. Wisdom, but my favorite is trustworthiness, because I can see the whole foundation of Asian culture in this idea of trustworthiness, which doesn't necessarily mean the same thing in the West as Confucius meant. He meant dependably acting as expected, placing society over self. Now, acting as we would say, trustworthiness is acting as you have said you would act. You know, if you say you're going to do this, you do it. You're trustworthy. But that's not what this is. It's acting as I expect you to act. In other words, don't try something different. Don't try something new. There's a tried and true way to do it. Tradition is important. Act as tradition tells you to act. And it's very, all of Asian philosophy is sort of antagonistic to the idea of change. There's a sense of the constant. Hold on. Hi.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
All the way around. Are you still in the middle of class?
I am, but I've warned them all about what's going on. So
okay.
They're fully aware.
Okay. I did find a hole in your soffit over there at the very end of the building.
Excellent.
So I'll report that. And
okay.
Is
he out?
I can't tell. There was nothing up. I didn't see any activity when I went up there, and I could only get this far. So if we put a trap on the hole, we'll know for sure if they're in or out. We'll leave that up there for a few days, and then you let us know if you hear any.
Okay,
movement.
if I hear any scratching again.
Yeah.
So do you have like a card or something so I can call you direct?
I do out in the call.
Okay.
Did you save my number?
Yes.
That's my check number.
All right, I'll make a note of what
Would you like me to get a card?
I would if you can get that.
I'll be right back.
I'll just leave that up. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, everybody. So you've all heard what's happening with my squirrel. Hopefully he's gone. I haven't heard him for a couple of hours. Okay, so those are the cardinal virtues, emphasizing tradition and sameness. The 5 relationships. This is a real core aspect as well. It's interesting who's not mentioned as much as who is mentioned. The father-son relationship. There's no mother-daughter relationship mentioned. Ruler-subject, husband-wife, older brother, younger brother, friends, and equals. By regulating them, what he's talking about is interacting with people in an expected and acceptable manner, and that a harmonious society is dependent on harmonious individuals. I mean, it all starts with the individual. Within your family, you build a harmonious relationship with the members of your family, and then your family builds a relationship with other families in your village, and then your village builds a relationship with other villages, and it grows and grows and grows until you have the people who form their relationship with the ruler, the king. I'm going to shut this door so my cat doesn't. Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Perfect timing.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Okay. Door closed. A perfect relationship with the king or the ruler. And that's important. That fact that a king, or very soon an emperor, but at this point a king, has responsibilities as well as the people. The people have responsibilities to the ruler. The ruler has responsibilities to the people. And they don't necessarily always like that idea. In fact, we're about to encounter someone who didn't like that idea at all. And his name is Qin. Now, when the Zhao eventually will fall apart, they managed to make it for 900 years. So I'm pretty impressed with, so if they want to take a break and fall apart after 900 years, I'm going to cut them some slack. But after a brief period of sort of chaos where all these little kingdoms are battling one another for power, one person takes power. And he was the King Chen, it was his name, King Cheng of Qin. And he took power, united the warring states, and declared himself emperor, took the title Wang, which means emperor, and really established the imperial system in China. He's the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, which basically means emperor, emperor of Qin. It also has other implications in the name. Other aspects of those words imply center of the world. So he's the center of the world and the king of Qin. It implies the pinnacle of human society is all implied. I've never studied what I'm going to call Chinese, even though we all understand there's no language called Chinese. It's generally Mandarin, but there is one written language we call Chinese. So if we're talking about script, there is only one Chinese. There are many spoken languages. And we're right at the point where that's going to actually happen, because one of the things that Qin Shi Huang does is to codify and create a standardized script. This is an image that's, is supposedly of him, but it was painted much, much later. And I'm sure they wouldn't have had a clue what he actually looked like. But I do like this image. We're going to look at images of other emperors later. And there is a convention for how you show an emperor. Usually there's someone sort of big, they have a lot of girth to, wide barrel chest usually, and sort of fierce looking people. But anyway, he was a brutal person. Most people are familiar with this guy to a certain extent. The movie Hero from, oh gosh, it's been a long time now, what, 20 years or something? A Chinese film called Hero was the story of Qin Shi Huang and his paranoia, but he was deeply, deeply paranoid and quite brutal. The first thing he did was ban all philosophy. He hated this idea of philosophy. I think, did you get a copy of the legalism handout? Did that go out with the other handouts? Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Legalism. Legalism was, did I hear a yes or?
Yes.
Legalism, okay, you got it. Okay, was one of those 100 schools of philosophy, but he banned all the other 99 and embraced legalism, which is a bizarre term. Nonetheless, it's the term we use. The reason he did not like all these other philosophies is because they didn't agree with one another. Knowledge is totally useless if you can't all agree what's true or not true. All you do is argue, and you all have different beliefs, so you're useless to me. So I'm going to tell you what is true, and that's it. You don't need to bother debating it or, wasting all this time on precedent or the past or whatever. And then this legalism handout, I love this. It's I only put two paragraphs here of the full inscription. This was one of the earliest, what we call stone classics. Stone classic is a term they use in China for some sort of official statement that was chiseled on stone and put in a public place, and it becomes sort of classic. And this is common from here on. All sorts of important edicts or whatever be chiseled on a big hunks of stone and just put in a public place. It's like a big billboard or whatever with information on them. And so that's what he did with this. But it was actually like 2 pages long. I just pulled out 2 little bits of it because it goes on and on and on. Of how great he is. I mean, that's all it says is, a new age is inaugurated by the emperor. Everything is rectified. All affairs are clear. Everyone's in harmony. Everybody's happy. Human life is perfect. He's achieved more than anybody else. Even the beasts in the field, all creatures benefit. all live in peace and home, and just 2 more pages of that, of the same thing over and over again. But the most interesting part is this debate at the bottom, where he had his scholars. One scholar said, I have yet to hear of anything able to endure that was not based on ancient precedent. Not a good idea to say in front of Qin Shi Huang, because he didn't like the idea of ancient precedent. He wanted to get rid of everything in the past or any other ideas. And so they had this debate. And this is where this sycophant scholar, who's saying what he needs to say in order to, not get himself executed, is basically arguing, we need to burn all the books. We don't need books on anything except like agriculture and medicine, and no philosophies. And you're just wasting your time with these debates. And if we catch you with these books, you'll be executed. And the emperor ended up sanctioning that proposal. So it's very, very brutal. And that also, his paranoia, dictators of any kind, totalitarians, always suppress the intellectuals and academics, because they can challenge you and they can make arguments against you, and then usually that goes along with paranoia, because you assume everybody's trying to do this. And he's the classic dictator, paranoid dictator. He also desperately wanted to be immortal, and tried everything. He sent his wise men, his astrologers, out to find, the secrets of immortality. And one of the last things that they brought him was mercury, that this would make you immortal. And he didn't live very long after that, for fairly obvious reasons. Mercury does not make you immortal, quite the opposite. So legalism is basically, I'm going to tell you what things are, and that's it. There's really nothing. It's not particularly complicated. However, he did do some positive things, and there's another side to totalitarianism, and that is you have the ability to muster resources in a way that, Joe Biden just can't. He's got other people he has to listen to, and people can do nasty things like voting and wasting our time, but he could do whatever he wanted. So number one, he unites the nation. And one of the things you have to do with unite a nation in which people speak many different languages is you have to find a way for people to communicate. And this is where he really established this Chinese ideogram system, because its whole purpose is to allow people who speak different languages to communicate in a written language. You have a shared written language, because the ideograms have nothing to do with your speaking, what you say. They have nothing to do with words. They're ideas. They're images of ideas. So, and I they're incredibly complicated. I know people that have studied Chinese languages all their life, and they still don't know the ideograms. They just learn the spoken languages. There are over 50,000 of them altogether, and they're living things. They can add on ideas. So if one mark symbolizes, if this shape symbolizes a house, then you can add on the idea that, well, I can have this line and it signifies it's my house in the country. Or if I add a couple marks here, now it becomes my house in the country that I don't live in most of the year. Or, each little addition or mark is a way of adding to or sort of shaping the idea or the meaning of that word. And therefore, it doesn't matter what word I use for house, because I see this shape, and you can write any language in Chinese ideograms. Any spoken language can be written and read in Chinese ideograms if you know what they mean, if you learn them. It was his way of further unifying an empire, but it was also the beginning of the power of script and calligraphy. You're your ability to make these marks. These marks have sort of values, that they're not just letters and words, but they have character and they have moral value that is being communicated. So the nature of making the arts making the marks becomes extremely important, and increasingly what an educated person would need to know. They honor the literate. The literate are elevated and honored. It's been said that while there are 50,000 characters, you certainly don't need to know all of them, but you need 3,000 characters to be able to read a newspaper. You need to know 3,000. You need 5,000 characters to be a well-educated person. If you can read 5,000, now you're considered well-educated, and 8,000 to be considered a scholar. So you only need 8,000 to be a scholar. So all these others beyond that are really just specialties for other areas. I mean, there are other people, one scholar needs these 8,000, another scholar needs those 8,000, depending on sort of what you were talking about. And we're going to talk about calligraphy in much more detail later. It's in later periods where calligraphy becomes a much more codified art form. And there are specific styles of calligraphy that are used for different sorts of things that you are talking about, etc. So we'll definitely come back to that later. I want to say some things about the wall. The Great Walls of China is sort of like the Silk Road, in the sense that there is no actual Silk Road. There is no actual Great Wall of China. There are a whole lot of different walls. In fact, the Chinese don't use that terminology. They don't call anything the Great Wall. The walls began being built during as early as the Zhou that we just talked about, and they were building just small, discrete little sections here or there to maybe separate them from a troublesome neighbor. And these were all basically mud mounds, mud brick walls. These were not, most of them sort of washed away. What the Emperor of Qin, or the Qin Shi Huang, does is to begin unifying many of those walls. This red is the Qin. It's hard to see which is red. Some of them look more orange than red, but he does put a lot of work into it. Although he's still just working in mud brick, it's said that, one of the things he did to punish sort of convicted criminals and anybody else that sort of got on his bad side is you could be conscripted to work on the wall. And it's said that up to 1 million people died during his reign working on the wall. Now, the Qin dynasty lasted 15 years. That's 1-5. That follows the Zhou, which lasted 900. So there's a big variation here. The Qin might be a short dynasty, but it's a very important one in establishing this imperial lineage. The wall, we'll look at the wall that we're all familiar with, that you've seen pictures of, that you may have visited in China. That is what's known as the Ming Wall, and that was all built much, much later in the Ming Dynasty. That's a stone wall. And that's what people tend to call the Great Wall today. But we're talking about all these other, in China, they call it the Long Wall, but it's also known as the Ming Wall. And that's north of Beijing, which isn't even on this map, which is somewhere right in here, I think. Anyhow, we'll come back to that when we get to the Ming and talk about that. But there are walls being built, that's sort of pounded earth during this time. As you can see, there are a whole lot of them. Now, the most famous part of Qin Shi Huang is, of course, his tomb. It's famous for it. Has anybody been to China? Anybody visited Xi'an and seen this site?
I have. Bonnie.
No, I studied Chinese in Beijing for 6 months.
Oh, how wonderful.
And I was a guide for a photographer in 2010. So, and we slept on the Great Wall, but Yeah, I studied the language and the writing system and interpreted and translated and all that. So,
Oh, wow.
yeah.
You're doing pretty good. I've
So,
heard
so the pronunciation of the emperor's Qin Shi Huang,
yeah.
Huang, and
That's good.
it's actually Hung. Yeah, it is emperor. Wang is king. So, yeah. So yeah. So there you go.
Say it one more time. Say his name one more time.
Qin Shi Huang.
Qin Shi Wang.
Qin
Qin Shi
Huang.
Qin Shi Wang. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll probably just go ahead and say Qin Shi Wang again,
Yeah.
the way I
Yeah.
know how to say.
Sorry.
I'm
not sure about the tones. So
I know because it's up and down and
yeah,
flat.
I have to look and see what the tone markers are.
Yeah.
So.
I had a number of friends that were studying Chinese and telling us little bits about how some words go up where you go, and some words go down, and then some are flat, and you change the meaning completely. And
yeah, there's a little, not really an idiom, but there's, let me see if I can say it correctly. Ma, 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 ma. And it basically 4 different characters, 4 different pronunciations as far as tone. The romanization is all the same, MA. Character is different, but it basically means mother is angry at the horse or punishing the horse with a rope or something like that. Anyway, but that's how we learned our ma, 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 ma. So first tone, second tone, third tone, fourth tone.
Wow. Yeah, I think I'll pass on that, on learning Chinese.
I love it. It's actually, it's a I call it a God, now I can't even remember anyway, it's very simple in its complexities.
Yeah. Well, I was in Beijing, and then we went down to Xi'an. So just Beijing, and saw everything sort of in that area, including the wall. You know, we went up to the wall just north of Beijing, and then took the overnight train down to Xi'an.
Yeah.
It was like a 12-hour overnight train ride down to Xi'an. They have wonderful trains. They make Amtrak look like pathetic compared to the gorgeous railway system in China.
Yeah, but I could talk more, and I'm not going to, because that's not what this is
but that's
about.
okay. If you've got anything relating to, jump in. If there's anything you've experienced or know about that we're talking about, I want people to jump in and add to it.
Okay.
Because my experience is only my experience. That's not all that much.
Yeah.
It's the tomb. It's very, very famous. Discovered in 1974. Some farmers were digging for a well, and they started bringing up these parts of like a head, a ceramic head, or an arm or something like that. And that's when the excavation really started. It's really considered sort of the greatest archaeological find, I think, ever. I don't think there's anything comparable to this. And it's not all excavated. This is part of it. This is pit 1. Did you get to go down here, Angie? No, didn't get to Xi'an. It's located outside Xi'an, which is the ancient capital of Chang'an. For much of Chinese history, Chang'an was the capital. Beijing is only a late capital. It's way far north. Most of the capitals are farther south. So it was an important site. When you go there, like one of the first things you do is like everywhere else, you get directed, depending on the language you speak, you get directed into this space where they have a big video or film for you that, tells you the background of it. And that was really interesting. He used about 700,000 workers to create this incredible site. This building is bigger than any airplane hangar. It's about the size of 3 football stadiums, big football stadiums, like 3 of them side by side, and it's literally built over the exposition. and you can see the size of the people there. So this is just one of the pits. This is from the ground. There's a huge museum next to it, and then pit 2 over to the side. We'll look inside. This is generally the view you get of pit 1. It's absolutely massive. There are around 7,000 life-size figures in this grouping alone, and we'll look at them up close, but they're ceramic figures. They're generally known as the terracotta warriors, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with them. They're very well known in this country, and there's often groups of them that are touring, sort of traveling exhibitions of them. It's believed to be a complete reconstruction of the Qin Empire. I mean, he's just reconstructing everything. And I'll talk about his tumulus, his actual burial site, in a little bit. And that's a reconstruction of a Qin city and probably, his whole compound as well. These figures were made in assembly line process. Now, one of the things we learned from all this placement is a lot about military tactics, because they're laid out. It's an army. It's a massive Qin. It's the whole Qin army, basically, in military formation, because you could see how people were organized and placed, and there's a great deal to learn about all of that. This is just a plan of part of it. As you can see, they stopped excavating. Only the front part is excavated. Is one of the things they learned right away, is that as soon as these hit the air, the paint just went. The paint is gone. There's no paint left on these figures. So they sort of stopped excavating until they figured out sort of how to excavate them and then immediately preserve that paint. And they have figured that out, but fairly recently. They did a lot of damage, but fortunately they stopped. You can see there are war chariots. There are some gaps here, but you can see there's some horses here. There are war chariots lined up, but these are mostly infantry. You get a bunch of robed warriors in the front. We'll take a look at them as well. Here's some of the robed warriors in the front with officers in the rear. Of these figures, there are no two alike. Every single one is different, and that doesn't mean they were handmade. They're assembly made using interchangeable parts. There are several different styles of face designs, several hair designs, different uniform designs, and when you take these maybe 6 or 7 different parts that are put together, because they're hollow and they're really just put together, then you could have just this vast geometric potential for uniqueness in each figure. The hairstyles, the uniforms identify ranks. Often their faces themselves or their facial hair identify about them as well. For example, here are some different variations of heads and face types. I know I've read a lot about the hair. The hair is very important in identifying your rank and your status. And now you combine them with different uniforms and the like, and you can see where you get uniqueness. All these are various uniform types that also go with different body types. They're all completely hollow, and the heads are literally just set in there, on top of the body. So you could take off a head and shift it. What is interesting is the detail. I mean, the incredible detail that you see. These would be leather garments and some sort of rivet-like forms that are probably leather things that are holding them in place, and then the little tassels for each one. This is a general who's identified not only by his uniform, but this hair thing is very much a general. And he's shown as a sort of older man. You can imagine the 700,000 people, not all at once, but that's in the whole project. I say it was discovered in 1974, but in reality, on some level, people have talked about the tomb of Qin Shi Huang for thousands of years. I mean, there's kind of been rumors that he had this tomb constructed, and even a lot of rumors that described what it looked like before it was even found. So it's not quite like, well, we didn't know this existed. It's just that we finally discovered it. Some people have even said that, well, the farmers in that area have always known there was something down there. They just didn't tell anybody about it till this one guy found something and became famous because of it. At the very back of that huge Pit 1 building, you find a lot of, well, not much left of the chariots, because I think they were bronze, and the bronze didn't last underground, but the horses at the back, and the charioteers, so he would have been holding probably bronze straps. Interesting horses, they're like tiny. I seriously doubt Chinese horses were really small, but they're unusually small as horses, and they're very stiff as well, very formal, and all pretty much alike as horses. This was Pit 2, and Pit 2 is really the pit of the war chariots, where and the archers. The Pit 1 is mostly infantry with some war chariots. Pit 2, which has not been excavated much because they were waiting till they could do it more safely. But these are all war chariots, and in this case, people have identified quite a few hundred different chariots, as well as the archers, who are my favorites. I love the archers. This is from Pit 2. This is a striding infantryman, and the kneeling archer. I love the kneeling archers. I'm not sure why, I just really love them. He would have originally been holding a crossbow, a very large crossbow, which would have been sort of sitting on the ground as he's sort of waiting, sort of at ease. The detail, again, is a bit overwhelming. Look at this detail of this archer's shoe. I mean, the bottom of the shoe, it looks like a Nike on the bottom. I mean, all these details are carved into it to give it this richness for something that's going to be covered up. I mean, this is a tomb of a megalomaniac. This is someone who only in office 15 years. I mean, how you could even do this in 15 years? The resources that you have to bring together to accomplish something like this in this time is really a sort of overwhelming. But I love little details like that. They also found a little farther away, this isn't found in the same place, it's maybe like a half a mile away or something, I don't remember. But these were removed and these were in the museum. Now, these are not life-size. There, as you can see, they're half-size. And the chariots are bronze. I don't know if the horses are bronze or ceramics. I can't quite tell from the photo, and I honestly don't remember. They may be bronze, but I know that the war chariot up above was actually gilded. It's made of bronze and then had gold around it. That's a fascinating structure. There's a sliding window on the side. You can see that one little window that sort of someone inside can slide it back and look out and then close it again. And there's a door at the back. This is for the emperor. When the emperor left, he went in his solid metal war chariot. So he was so paranoid that someone was going to kill him or whatever. So this is, if there was a battle, the emperor would go, but he would go in his, it's like a tank. It's basically the Qin version of a tank that nobody can get into. And then, smaller chariots like this would sort of accompany the war chariot with the emperor in it, with various things that he might need. For example, here's a detail with some straps left. So these are really beautiful, and they're really interesting size, or half size. But his actual tumulus, or in other words, tomb where he is buried, is about a mile away. I think that's probably it over here, I'm guessing. No, that may not be it, because this actually sits in the middle of a military base today. So I'm not sure when that picture was taken. They haven't opened it up. There's clearly a huge pyramid below ground, but they haven't opened it up. They've used sort of ground piercing radar to try and read as much as they can. And they've done some soil testing. And the reason they haven't opened it up is because under this massive thing, he had constructed this, and I would just give anything to see it. This massive Qin city is reconstructed with streets and the river circulating it. When we look at some other architecture and some Chinese painting and the like, and we talk about the Forbidden City and stuff later, we'll talk about geomancy or the belief in the power and energy within the earth. But one of the things the Chinese believe is the relationship with flowing water, that this qi or energy is connected to the idea of flowing water. So having moats or flowing water around your palace or around your city, these bring, positive energy and good energy. The problem with this is the rivers that are constructed for his tomb are made with flowing mercury. They're rivers of mercury. And what it took, again, to get enough liquid mercury to create a river flowing around your tomb is almost unthinkable. But because that rumor had been there, people have been saying forever that he had this magic river of mercury. Of course, a long time ago, they didn't know what that meant, but we know what that means now. So just in case that was true, they decided not to go digging down in here, but to do some soil testing. And lo and behold, yeah, it's full of mercury. So until someone can figure out how to safely open this thing and excavate, nobody's going to touch this. Now, I don't know, but it certainly looks to me like there's crops growing all around here. These look like tilled fields to me. I really don't know. I also have read that this is now in the middle of an army camp, that you would have to go into an army camp to get to this site. So again, information is always tricky in China, but that's what I've recently read. So that's why it hasn't been excavated. But I know they do know it's a massive constructed pyramid, and under that pyramid is a city with buildings and streets and rivers, and it would be, it would make the terracotta warriors look sort of, uninteresting compared to what's under here. But I don't know that we'll ever there's got to be some way they can x-ray it or figure out how to show us that burial, but that's where his body is located. I hope he's happy, because he got his mercury, and he did die from poisoning, mercury poisoning. And he had a son who took over. His son couldn't hold it together. It was the only reason the Qin held together was this man, this sort of brutal man. His son just wasn't up to it. And within a year, the peasants, overthrew him. And we move into the first golden age, China's first golden age, and that is the Han Dynasty, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But it's during the Han that the Silk Road opens up. The Han Dynasty, I've got the dates here, roughly, I always remember the Han, it's roughly 200 BC to 200 CE. So it's about 400 years on either side of the birth of Christ. It overlaps the Roman Empire, the late Roman Republic, and most of the height of the Roman Empire. So I always remember it like that. It's easy to remember. And it's during this period the Silk Road opens. And they definitely, here's Xi'an, ancient Chang'an. Chang'an is the ancient name. It's the Han capital as well, and it will continue to be the capital for many dynasties. The modern name is Xi'an. As you can see, it's at the end here of the Silk Road. And so we do know that it's during the Han that number one, connection to the rest of Asia, and as well as, all the way out to the Mediterranean is happening. And also it's the period where Buddhism will enter during the Han. But for the first, up to 200 CE, Buddhist monks are around, but it's really not embraced by the Chinese. For those first, 150 years or so, it's a foreign religion, and there are sort of mostly Indian monks, and so it's not really a Chinese religion yet, but it's clearly there, and people are, seeing and experiencing and being exposed to it. So when the Qin fell, it fell quickly to a peasant leader who identified himself or called himself Han. I'm probably saying this wrong again, Angie. Han Gaozu, something like that, which means exalted emperor of Han, roughly. And like I said, it is considered China's first golden age. China has this very long period. So it has two golden ages. It's the only country I know that has two. And from this point on, all emperors call themselves sons of Han, and the Chinese people are known as Han. Han becomes an ethnicity. So to be Han is to be pure Chinese, as opposed to other ethnic mixtures, and that's a use of the term that comes along a little bit later. But this is where it comes from. It comes from this period of Han. A lot of important things are happening during this time. When you look at this map of Han, one of the things you notice is they've progressed quite a bit farther west. You also notice this sort of narrowing here. This is called the Gansu region, this sort of narrow area. Of course, the Silk Road goes through here. It's really the passage. It's similar to the Khyber Pass in India, where there was like this one area you could get through to get into India in the northwest. And interestingly, in China, it's also in the northwest. And it's not a pass through the mountains, but rather a pass in between the mountains, because this is basically the border of Tibet you're looking at here, the high plateau and the Himalayas, and then the plateau of Tibet, and also a desert. There's also a very important desert we'll talk about later. And then the Gobi Desert is over here. So the only real passage is between the deserts. So controlling this area is very important. It became a sacred area, and even though the capital's down here, the elite tombs of the Han are mostly in here. We find in the Gansu a lot of tombs, or what we call elite tombs, or basically the only tombs you're going to find are elite tombs. It's the wealthy that can afford to have these tombs. So it's also an important place we're going to come back to, because some of the sort of cities and settlements along here, along the Silk Road, are very important, again, for sort of these interconnections, because this is where, one Silk Road might go north and one south. And these are places where ideas are exchanged and ideas enter and leave at the same time. Now, one of the most important contributions of the Han dynasty is the Han Academy that was set up. It's a school, an academy, where you could go to prepare for the civil service exam. They set up a civil service examination. The Han period was a period of great growth in government, the size of government, the number of government officials. They're called scholar officials. And if we could only have scholar officials leading our country, that would be really great. There were as many as 120,000, scholar officials in Chang'an at any one given moment. That's a lot of officials. And your entryway to that very highly sought after job was civil service examination. That actually opens the door. It's a very, it seems anyway on the surface, a bit more liberal, or opening up good jobs to more people. However, when you realize that you had to be pretty wealthy to have access to, to go to the academy or to become educated, it still means that wealthier, more powerful people are in a position to take government jobs. But with subsequent dynasties, that does begin to open up more, and you have more access to jobs. Like if you're a really, really smart person later on, anyway, you could still, through your own labor and abilities, work your way into good positions. Now, at the Han Academy, they taught 5 classics. These are also stone classics, by the way, because all of these were carved on stone and put up in Luoyang. They had 2 capitals, actually, an eastern and a western, depending on where the emperor was, but these were in the eastern capital. And this is what it was important for them to study: law, poetry, the I Ching, or the Book of Changes, the canon of rituals, and Confucius, writings of Confucius. And more Confucius, knowing Confucius, became more and more important on the exams. And it turned sort of Confucianism into sort of a state philosophy. It unified the government, it unified the nation, and it became the kind of foundation upon which a government could be constructed. Now, it's interesting because I just got finished last week with a class I was teaching at JCCC on Renaissance art. And we had just looked at, some of you may remember, the painting by Raphael, in which he painted, like, it was the School of Athens. And remember, in that room, each wall was dedicated to one of the 4 scholarly principles that were most valued during the Renaissance in Europe. And one of them was law, and one of them was poetry. And I talked about how, we don't honor poetry that way today. We don't have a college of poetry or anything like that. But I find it interesting that both in China and in Renaissance Europe, poetry was highly elevated. It was the art of the intellectual. It was something that any educated person should master, should know, to have access to. And it's still considered that today. It's still very important in many countries. And there are many places in Africa also where poetry was at the core of culture. And by the way, I've put this on in the back of my mind on my to-do list, is that the next thing I want to do is develop a course on the art of Africa, which is something I could do right now on a small scale, but I would like to develop my own understanding a little bit more and give it a little more depth. So that's next on the line. So anyway, these are the things you had to know. The canon of rituals, which is also, Confucian, is of course important. But the I Ching, I think that's sort of the interesting one. I know that many of you know what the I Ching is and have probably played around with it, because if you're anywhere near my age, you know what the I Ching is, right? Who knows what the I Ching is? Okay, there are people that know what the I Ching is and how it's used, because we were all doing the I Ching, back in the day. But the I Ching, I still got, come to think of it, I've still got my I Ching and my little book about the I Ching. I gotta find those somewhere. It's a little book, and it's been a long time, so you may need to correct me, but it's a little book with that. Oh, geez, somebody else could probably explain this better than me. I know we used coins, but you can use coins or sticks, and you throw them and they give you symbols, and then you can look them up. It's like you ask a question and then you roll the sticks. Kay's looking for her I Ching. I'll bet you. Yeah, she's found it. She's found it. I can't hear you.
Because I remember none of it, so I have to.
Yeah, me either. I can't even remember the details, but I know there are these little little bars, these little marks that are short and long marks in different, I didn't remember what they're called. Yeah, there they are. And when you throw a coin or stick or whatever, and then whatever you roll, you could look it up. It's like a reference book, and you could look this up, and it's related to the yin and yang. That's about all I remember, but it gives you advice. It's like advice of how to handle things. It's like your morning horoscope. In some ways, the advice is like, well, that's good advice, but then no matter what your question was, that would be good advice. It's something like that. But look up the I Ching. It's really interesting, but it's supposedly, it's often talked about as forecasting things. But from our experience, it doesn't actually forecast much. It's more or less just advice how to handle a certain situation.
It's a divination.
Right.
Yeah, divination, but it's a little less than divination. It's a little more just advice. But I know it's deeply rooted in the yin and yang and the Tao.
Yeah, the yang, I think, is the solid line, and the yin is the broken line.
That's right. That's right.
And there are 64 hexagrams and different
Hexagrams.
combinations of those. Anyway,
I forgot the words.
Probably the thing that we would be most familiar with it's like rolling dice.
Yeah.
You know, like when you play Yahtzee, you know, you roll 5 dice and you might get two of one number and 3 of another number, and that's a great thing because it gives you a certain score. And that what you do is you look up in the book and say, okay, if you got 2 4s and 3 5s,
Right.
what does that mean? And you get this little cryptic
That's
fortune
it.
thing.
It's very
And-
cryptic.
And then you have to interpret.
Right. So it's a bit
But
like
how does
tarot.
that apply to my situation?
It's sort of
So-
like the tarot,
Yes.
because somebody's got to interpret it. Yeah, you put this out, but what does that mean? It's
Right.
vague and you don't know. And some people claim to be very good at interpreting it. But yeah, that's the I Ching, built into the government of the Han. I love that. So now you can all go out and learn how to throw the I Ching, look up your destiny. We have a number of elite tombs from this period, but the most famous is the tomb of General Zhang, and this tomb is phenomenal. In this particular case, General Zhang is well known. In his tomb, there were 38 bronze horses. These are a few of them. You can see the size. They're not huge, but they're a good size, and they're very typical of elite tombs. He was a governor general of this area, and he was a well-known person. This is somebody we actually know quite a bit about. He traveled throughout Asia, not just in China, but throughout Asia, looking for horses. He was a horse breeder, and he brought back a new breed of horses, a sort of light fleet horse, not a big heavy horse. And in fact, I will show you, this is actually one of the most famous pieces of all Chinese art, the flying horse from the tomb of General Zhang. And this is the new breed that he brought back. The name of the breed is roughly translated as like celestial. And this horse has got a hoof on a bird down here, swallow. And the name of the breed in Chinese is this, close to the name of the swallow bird in Chinese. So it's sort of playing on swift of foot, and flying and the name and all of that. But it's very important. It's something we're going to see over and over again, the importance of horses that make and build and maintain the empire. And that in fact, to be a leader of men, you have to prove yourself as a master of horses and even a breeder of horses. And this whole general is like the perfect example of that, that he mastered this horse and brought it back to China and bred it. And this proved his status and his position. It's really a beautiful bronze piece. And it's really interesting to compare to the earlier Qin. It's almost like you can see they're both representations of a moment in time, of their moment in time. Qin is this rigid, stiff, unanimated, produced in multiples, this mass produced with no character of any kind. And then of course it's bigger. It's like, it's either a full-size small horse or whatever, but it's big, where this flying horse is much smaller, but it's very much of the Han sort of moment in time as well. And I don't think I want to start anything else right now. I think we'll just call it that for today. But I would be glad to hear any comments or questions, additions, anything anybody has to say. This is a good time to do it.
Well, can I say a little something in
Sure.
defense of Confucius and spontaneity? Because it certainly there's a rigidity to the culture and a dependence on classics and a certain ideal of changelessness. But at the same time, I think of Confucius as kind of a humanist, because he's not focused on God said it and therefore it's true.
Right.
He has a very abstract idea of heaven as sort of the source of divine energy, but it's not very personalized at all. And it's
Right.
not, it's more like the I Ching, heaven's decrees are whatever you can figure out that they might be, that's God
Right.
never comes along and says, do this. It's never that unambiguous. And so when he describes the sage or the gentleman or sort of the ideal person, there is an expectation of spontaneity in that person, that they should be able to create poetry out of their response to the changes of the natural world. They should be able to, if they are in the presence of someone who is not as well educated and doesn't know all the social rules, they should be able to do everything to make that person comfortable. They don't go rubbing in their own superiority. The true sage makes that person feel like they are their equal, that they are welcome and have dignity and are respected. And that you have to be sensitive and creative in order to be able to do that for someone else. So that the sage should be someone who is very aware of themselves and their impact on other people, and can change in the moment, can do that thing in the moment that is going to contribute to order and comfort and everybody feeling okay about things. So I just don't want people to get the sense of it's lockstep, because
Right.
there's a piece of it that isn't.
Well, that's a good point, because I really didn't intend to make it seem as much as I did, apparently, because it's very much, as we will see in art, the same way. I mean, obviously we're looking at the progression of art, so obviously there's change. Otherwise everybody would still be doing it the way the first person ever did it. But it's a different respect for tradition than we have now. You start with tradition.
Right.
In fact, that's why there's so much, literally copying and duplicates. I mean, we're going to look at things that are literally a copy of something made 300 years earlier, because that no longer exists. So we'll look at that copy from a later period because it was just like it. I mean, you copy it and then you learn from that and then you make your contribution. So yeah, it's a starting with tradition and then finding your path once you've acknowledged that. But yeah, that's an idea that we can keep an eye on and watch as we move on through other things. Thank you. Anybody else? Questions, comments?
Where were those bells? All those bells that you showed that.
Where are they now? I'm not really sure. I have probably in a museum in China somewhere, but I'd have to look it up. I honestly don't know.
Yeah,
I don't remember. Yeah, I'll find that out for next time. Let you know.
Has nobody ever tried to play them in the modern era?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll bet you they're all dying to. I wonder. Somebody
would-
must.
How
Oh,
could
yeah.
you resist going in there with a mallet and saying, we have to know what this sounds like?
Well, somebody must have, because they're saying things like there are two different tones. Well, how do you know that? You must have rung the bell. So yeah, somebody has. I'm sure they don't just let anybody do it. But yeah, the temptation to slam those bells would be. I'm sure they keep the visitors well back from the bells, but they're gorgeous.
Mhm.
I suspect at one time in most of the world, not everywhere, but in most of the world, if you go back far enough, it was a common practice to bury servants, or in this case musicians, and people have suggested that way back, that possibly the musicians were sent along to play the bells for someone, but at this time they weren't when these bells were made.
Or at least you'd want to replicate a few of them.
Yeah, you could
Even if
replicate
you
them, sure.
wanted to take care of the originals, can we figure out how they made them and what then make
Get
a
the
new one so
bronze,
we could
yeah.
figure out what it would sound like?
Yeah, I wonder if the different alloys make different sounds.
Probably.
Different chemical alloys. That's interesting.
You got bronze and ceramic and jade. When does the more fragile stuff start? Like artwork and carving on
Soon.
bamboo and
Soon.
stuff.
Well,
showing up?
That's with Buddhism. Buddhism brings imagery. Buddhism brings painting. It brings sculpting. They simply weren't doing that. It brings a narrative tradition. It brings a tradition of storytelling. And once you have storytelling, then you've got images. So it's right after this, because they'll, the next section is we'll start looking at the first Buddhist things, the first sculptures that, really in Indian style, they're Indian monks. That are bringing the ideas, but it really is completely associated with Buddhism. Yeah, and then it's just done widely, but it's going to start with what, caves, large sculptures of Buddha, just like you saw before. But it's interesting how it begins and where it begins and how it relates to it. So next time we get into that stuff.
All
The
right.
jade actually is quite, as much as jade symbolizes strength and durability, jade is very brittle. I mean, it's not that strong. I don't know, how it got, it's a hard stone, but the way they've carved it, and it'll crack and break pretty easily.
Hey, yeah, I'm always interested in fabrics. Were they doing silk
Yeah.
at this time? And when does the
Yes,
fabric
actually,
art begin?
there has been one or two silk pieces that were found in Han tombs, but it's just too fragile. But they were doing silk by Han, and it was precious. So by this time they were doing silk. There's a famous tomb of an old woman. I'm not sure. I don't remember who she was, but it's Han, and it had the oldest piece of silk that we have, that we know, was on her burial, and it's for some reason preserved pretty well. So yeah, we're at that point.
I have a
of silk.
question.
Yeah.
So you said that the Qin dynasty, I didn't pronounce that right, connected parts of the wall. When did the wall start? And was that from threat from the Mongolian?
It started during the Zhou.
Okay.
Apologies again for my pronunciation. They started putting up smaller sections. Some of that had to do with Mongols in the north, others just their own neighbors, their own enemies, putting up small, like these weren't like big walls. These were just big enough that a horseman couldn't really get over it very well. Mud brick wall. So it's the first bits and pieces, as far as we know, were in the Zhou. That's where you had all the different kingdoms, and they were all, it was a medieval period. Everybody was fighting everybody else, more or less.
And it was more or less completed then in the
The Qin is when he starts connecting them, but it's still completely not segmented. It's not until much later you get,
okay.
I mean, the Ming are the ones that up north build the big wall out of stone, really high, what we know of as the wall, and that's to keep the Mongols out, which of course didn't work.
And an interesting thing about the wall in its structure is the step variation, because you have steps that are really short in height
Uh-huh.
and narrow in depth. And then you have steps that are really high and narrow, or short and very long. So, you know, you're constantly trying to gauge, how am I walking up? And also, many of the workers on the wall who died while working on the wall have been buried in the wall.
Right. Yeah, there's
So
a lot of bodies. I didn't see those steps where we were. There weren't. I didn't see those, so I'm not.
yeah,
I wasn't familiar with that.
in 2010, we slept on the wall, and it was, I think it was Badaling, which is North Beijing. And that's where we had that
Huh.
very strong variation. And we also thought, well, if we're sleeping on the wall and all these people that have died building it, maybe there will be ghosts out or something, you know, we're just. But yeah, we slept in one of the guard towers, and
I didn't know they'd let you do that.
yeah, yeah,
Huh.
yeah.
That's interesting. Okay, thanks everybody. Bye-bye.